You can attach words like haven and sanctuary to the idea of a library. I think they are places where you can go and explore the self. The idea of the self, I think, is very important part of the idea of modernity. They are places where you can get in touch with yourself, if you like. Now, one can do that in one's own living room, I guess, as well, but no, it seems to me that libraries are places where you are, the joy of them is that you are at once in a communal atmosphere, but you are exploring the self, it seems to me. And there's something really quite rich about that combination. And then the irony is one is released again into the practical world where that enrichment that one has taken on board is then put again to a practical purpose. And when I say practical, I mean perhaps a communal, social purpose, to use it in its broadest way. And that perhaps fits in with the Enlightenment project that really pushed libraries forward 200-300 years ago.
One of the librarians in the 1850s, I think it was a very unusual figure. He was called Count Marioni, an Italian refugee. Italy at the time was going through revolution and refugees were coming over all the time to Britain. People like Antonio Panizzi, who was a great librarian of the British Library, was one of them. Marioni was nothing like as great as Panizzi. He's fairly obscure, but he had actually been a member of the short-lived Republican government under Mazzini, I think, in Rome in the 1840s. So quite a significant person in Italian history. Ended up in Nottingham, had contacts with Thomas Carlyle, the historian, who had friends in Nottingham whom we know about. And here he was at Bromley House. We've got books that have been written by him, entries, notes about the library and so on, in quite a distinctive, possibly Italian hand that he wrote. And this seems to me, again, to be a good illustration of how a smallish city in Britain in the 19th century was interacting and being influenced by events on the world stage.
The library as a metaphorical accumulation of knowledge and understanding and cultural wisdom, of a shared concept of society and of retrievable knowledge and information. That is essential to the informed population which underpins a functioning democracy.
One can point to negative controlling aspects of libraries, just like modernity and the Enlightenment project has certain negative connotations. And libraries can be controlling and bureaucratic par excellence. You won't find a better bureaucrat or an administrator than a good librarian.
The Bibliotheca Alexandrina has put back Alexandria on the tourist map. And luckily, we have a very good Governor General here who has helped also make this a great success. And we cooperate very closely with him because Alexandria has had a total facelift.
These are sort of the laughable events of public library history. And also during the First World War, libraries were mobilised very much for the war effort against the German threat, but also against the threat of evil trade unionists and socialists and so on.
The presence of books from all over the world, this is the heart and minds of all the intellects of the world to be here. And this has made easy access to the public in Egypt here.
Using libraries, public libraries that is, from an early age, one gets very aware of the nuances of social difference that occur on the site of the library. People using libraries, it's quite obvious they are of different social classes. And also it seems to me that the the bureaucracy of the library establishment has, in a way, links with ideas about authority, and therefore one thinks about class in that respect.
Many participants from the Arab countries, as I probably mentioned to you, were major donors to the establishment of such a library. I will briefly say Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, or the Sultanate of Oman, even Iraq, but way before 1990, where it presented 21 million US dollars for the construction phase of the library. They too are, on the other hand, other countries are now interested as a result of the revival of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. We had just the other day 2 delegations, one from Uzbekistan trying to see our experience in reviving their old library of oratory, for example. The Iraqis are interested in reviving the library of the Ashurian library in Baghdad, the old library that was also equally burned.
No, slow down. They're gonna run. They're gonna run. They're gonna run. I'm just gonna wait for people to run.
That library is an ultra-modern structure, as you can see, and yet it is so much connected with the past. And the real symbolism that exists in this library is fabulous. Here you have an incomplete sun disk, a reference to the sun in Egypt. It is incomplete because knowledge is incomplete. There is always room for more learning. So it takes the shape of an incomplete sun disk rising from the sea of Alexandria. And the sea is represented in a little pond outside there in the colors of the light blue and turquoise color of the Sea of the Mediterranean of Alexandria in particular. It is all surrounded by a gray granite wall, and in this gray granite wall you have the alphabet of the world. There is no one single sentence on this great granite wall, but simply the alphabet symbolical of the knowledge from all countries and from all languages in the world. And then you have a bridge running around from the University of Alexandria to the Library of Alexandria to the outside world and the sea. Again, the idea of continuation of civilization, symbolized in that little connecting bridge that we have outside. Another feature is the planetarium, which takes the shape of a moon-shaped like thing, again with a science museum, but concentrates on films connected with explorations of the outer space and others. Gives a chance for young people to know more about what is happening in the outside world, outside space and as such. Again, symbolical of the moon. Then you have the conference center with its pyramidal shapes. All these pyramids represent the earth, the solidity of the earth, with the plaza around. So you have the sun, the moon, the earth, and the sea, and the wall and the bridge. So all this symbolism is put together into one great concept of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina and its connections with the outside world and connections with life and thought.
This is the arrest of Christ, where Christ is placed between between his two captors, and where there's a premonition of what is to come by the crosses placed on either side of his head, by the shape of his body. His limbs are arranged in the form of a cross.
We have to distinguish up to a point between form and content. With a lot of material heritage objects, the point of interest is at least as much the form as the content, because the form teaches us about the content. And that would be true of a painting. It would certainly be true of a building, or a piece of sculpture, or a piece of historic fabric or clothing. The stuff we see in museums, right? Now, they have information content, and museum curators spend their time researching and interpreting the information content to interact with the viewer. Books also have an information content, but that information content is relatively easily transferable from one medium to another. And a photograph of a painting, to take a very obvious, very simple-minded example, however good it is, will never convey what it is like to stand in front of the painting.
The Book of Kells is the most famous decorated manuscript to survive from the Middle Ages in Ireland, and one of the most famous, if not the most famous, manuscript to survive from the Middle Ages generally in Europe. It's a copy of the four Gospels. It was written round about the year 800. It was written in the monastery of Kells, which is about 40 miles northwest of Dublin, by followers of the monks of St. Columcille. So that as a copy of the Gospels, it's not at all unique. There's nothing remarkable about it in terms of its text, but it's very remarkable for the quality of its decoration. And it seems to me a remarkable survivor, not only from its own library, which must have been very extensive, but from the whole corpus of medieval manuscripts which were produced in Ireland in the early medieval period.
Christianity was under threat from in the rest of Europe, the Dark Ages as they're called. The strength of Christian belief was pushed to the verges of the known world, Western Ireland, Western Scotland, Western Britain, and the monks created manuscripts which were a record of God's word, of their faith, of the spiritual approach to philosophy. And their thinking was to bring the light back into Europe. That was their thinking. They would record the Bible or the Testaments and bring them back into Europe and re-Christianize, re-civilize, in their terms, Europe.
Survival is not quite serendipitous, but we make assumptions that the best has survived. In fact, what survived is what people thought at the time was the best, and they selected it for survival. That becomes less true as we get nearer to the present time, and the whole concept of a legal deposit library, a comprehensive universal library, is that everything is there and future generations get access to it.
Ireland didn't save civilization, but its monks did have an important role in taking the written word into Europe at a time when Europe was a very disturbed, very violent place.
It survived the visitation of Cromwell's army to Ireland in the 17th century. It was kept for a while in the Church of Kells, even though the church was half ruined and was being used for the stabling of Cromwell's soldiers, so that at this point it was moved to Dublin for safekeeping. And we like to think that it's been safe since, but it also survived from a conservation point of view a number of very regrettable decisions in the 19th century. For example, the leaves were all chopped around the borders to make them uniform size. Very few medieval books start life off with uniform edges to them. It survived some misguided attempts at restoration in the 19th century, including the application of of pigment to certain parts of the pages. There was a kind of wash of kind of purple wash placed over some of the vellum leaves in order to try to give it a uniform appearance.
This is just another example of one of the books that we use as test material.
We actually measure the deterioration of paper by dissolving it up in solution, and then we can measure the actual molecular weight of the cellulose in paper using standard chemical procedures. We've developed a standard for permanent paper in Canada. It's the first standard for that that's been produced in this country, and what that does is essentially create a standard for paper that is guaranteed to survive, guaranteed to have the best properties for long-term survival, will probably last for hundreds of years.
Let's try this one. This is a slightly later one. I think by the look of it, 1899.
With a beautiful picture in it.
Yep, it's called The Praise of Gardens. And it's got pictures of the lady in the garden somewhere in Perthshire, Scotland. Selection of comments about gardens by all sorts of writers. And a label on the front of it which says, "This book is in demand. You can only have it for 7 days at a time."
The idea that some things were censored in the past because they were considered dangerous, like Tom Paine's The Rights of Man, which in Norwich Public Library in the 1870s was denied to certain people and kept on a special tab behind the counter because it was considered a slightly dangerous book and should only be made available to certain people.
There is also, I think, an issue, which is a serious one, about how people in general get access to, if you like, selected material, and how aware they are of the total body of material from which the selection has been made. And there we certainly have a political phenomenon, if you want to put it in those terms.
Library historians were writing the history of libraries as if issues of class, as if issues of culture simply didn't really impinge upon that history.
Our literary appreciation, our literary achievements, outstrip our artistic and our architectural. I mean, they're important, but the written word, the spoken word. I mean, Irish people speak. We have a reputation for talking and writing. And I think
paragraphs.
And paragraphs, and I think it's not. It's a demonstration of how important the word is.
Well, I would see the role of the book in Irish culture as an interesting kind of boomerang effect. Because I said to you, the book in many ways was brought by various colonizers. It was brought by Christians. It was then brought by the planters who worked in the name of Elizabeth I. But my view is, it's like weaponry you capture from the enemy and turn back against the enemy. And Irish nationalism emerged, as I was saying to you, in the 19th century through printing presses and through the kind of communal identity generated by print. And there's no doubt that the self-image of many Irish people has been powerfully conditioned by a writer like Yeats, who, in a way is one of the inventors of modern Ireland. And I could show you whole passages in the political speeches of De Valera and Michael Collins, who are arguably the two great political shapers of modern Ireland, which come directly out of the poetry of Yeats. And in fact, someone said that in one of the first meetings of the Irish Senate in a free state. He said, we wouldn't be sitting here now as free men and women, but for the poems of W.B. Yeats. So I think there is a lineal connection between writing and freedom in a culture like this. And in fact, Yeats himself said that that freedom was attributable to the rise of libraries and what were called reading rooms in Ireland in the middle of the 19th century, that so many of the leaders of nationalism actually met one another physically in libraries, in reading rooms, and read the same newspapers, read the same books, and had debates in debating societies in those libraries, and in that process actually forged a whole consciousness that led to the invention of modern Ireland. And I think that is actually a hopeful view of the use of the library.
That was a hope, but deep down I think people knew, and history has shown that it really wasn't the masses per se who were educated in libraries. It really was only the middle levels of society, if you can put it like that. The lower levels, the lumpen proletariat, what Marx called the scum, to put it blatantly. These were and never have been the constituency of public libraries.
The chapel or the church was once the central statement in architecture by the community about itself as a community. But look now, I mean, the libraries are actually the one place where the community identifies itself as such.
Libraries were established against the backdrop of the Chartist upheavals of the 1840s, the threat of revolution at the time in Britain, even though from hindsight we can see that threat wasn't a particularly strong threat. People were suggesting that libraries could be an antidote to the revolutionary ideas of the time. And that idea stayed with libraries, I think, right throughout the next half century. And libraries during the First World War, for example, were seen as potential bulwarks against the revolutionary threat that came from the communism of the Russian Revolution. So historically they are very much conservative in that respect. That doesn't mean to say that the middle classes have not been involved in promoting libraries for their own use as well. This is a slight misconception and a slightly shallow history, I think, to see public libraries historically as merely agencies to prevent revolution. There have been in recent years ideas about extending the public library right through society, and it's wrapped up in a notion of social inclusion, to extend the public library to include those who have been disenfranchised from culture.
Actually, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina is the jewel in the crown. Why? Because Mrs. Mubarak had adopted the whole idea of spreading the idea of small libraries all over the place, making it possible for young children to be able to go and use a library and read. And she championed the whole campaign on reading and reading for everybody. And there we have established several little public libraries all over the country, from south to north. And then came finally the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, and as I said, in our little, the jewel in the crown.
This seems to me quite a laudable objective, but one which flies in the face of the difficulties that the public library has had in meeting that objective in the past.
We had a conference, an international conference for young people, unemployment, youth and unemployment, held at the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. You can imagine the effect it had on many of those young people here. These were subjects that were not treated before. We have a problem of unemployment, no doubt, like any other country in the world. But yet we tackled such subjects, we looked into them. It was very important that it was not only left to governments to tackle such subjects. Why not an institution like the Bibliotheca Alexandrina that can have views and ideas from all over the world? How do we solve that problem? We need to solve such a problem. It is affecting our lives, it's affecting our economies, and affecting our youth.
Right at the origins of the public library in Britain, there was this hope that people would be educated out of their willingness to protest, that they would actually see the wisdom of the more technical capitalist society that was emerging in the mid-19th century. But in fact that didn't happen. Libraries have been agencies of social change as much as being agencies designed to stop social change.
One of the pangs of nationalism, we have an Irish language which very few Irish people speak. I speak it, I wish more people did.
A chilíonn an focail Islam sa teanga Arabíse na géile do dhia agus is Muslimach an duine a dhéanann de réir hill dé.
They're using slightly strange, old-fashioned language to express things that I find difficult.
There is a policy of promoting it at governmental level in the schools. This is controversial and sometimes opposed. We've had very good debates about both sides of that policy. Where have they been held? Because it's a divisive, painful issue, they've been held in local libraries, which are seen, if you like, as neutral ground that people can walk on together and have the debate with a degree of integrity. It's almost like a utopian space that's available to the community in which it can conduct what might be otherwise rancorous and difficult arguments. And I think that all those values are democratic values that go back to the reading room tradition I was talking about in the Irish 19th century. So what you're getting is a nationalism that, for all its flaws, is still trying to update itself and honour some of its original impulses.
Dublin, take 3.
جيمس جويس أهالي دبلن ترجمة أسامة من زلجي. بعض ربتات خفيفة على الزجاج جعلته يلتف نحو النافذة. ها قد عادت تثلث من جديد. راقب وهو ناعس نتف الثلج الفضية القائمة تستقط بانحراف على ضوء المصباح. لقد حان أو أنه كان ينطلق في رحلته نحو الغرب. نعم، كانت الصحف محقة. الثلج يغطي كل الأراضي الأيرلندية. إنه يسقط على كل جزء من السهل الأوسط المظلم على الهضاب الجرداء. يسقط بلطف على مستنقع ألن بعيدا نحو الغرب. يسقط برفق داخل أمواج نهر شانن المظلمة المتمردة. كان يسقط على كل جزء من فناء الكنيسة الموحش القائم على الهضبة التي يستوفي فيها مايكل فيوري ميتا. إنه يتراكم كثيفا على الصلبان المعقودة وشواهد القبور، على حراف البوابات الصغيرة، على الأشواك العارية. تخدرت روحه وهو ينصت على الثلج، يتساقط بهون على كل الكون ويسقط بهون على الأحياء الموتى كحلول نهايتهم الأخيرة.
There's a great deal of value to be had from people simply consuming fiction, that generally people reading fiction become more intelligent and more able to be communicative in society. We're meant to be involved in a networked information society, so it seems quite legitimate that a cultural state institution like the public library should be promoting that sort of literature.
When Roddy Doyle wrote a television series for the BBC called Family, which gave a very negative portrayal of the Irish male as a sort of irresponsible in his role as a father. And this would have all kinds of resonances, say, with black writing in the United States. You know, the sort of writing of Alice Walker, which was also accused of giving a very bad press to the black male. You remember when The Colour Purple was a book that was okay, but when it became a movie, she became hugely criticised within her own community as having kind of scored an own goal. Well, the same thing happened to Roddy Doyle here. Because this went out on the BBC, this was seen as, the Irish being made to look very bad by the neighbouring culture, which was, of course, the old imperial one, and that the kids who came from these particular areas would find it very hard to get jobs the following summer when they appeared before, hiring committees or whatever, because their community had been typecast. Now, Roddy Doyle was asked if he would debate all this with the members of the community who felt that they had been betrayed by his writing. And he did so. He was very brave. He went into Ballymun Library, which was the nearest library to that community. And the police had arrived because they reckoned he was going to need protection. And with a very lordly gesture, he dismissed them and told them he was quite capable of coping with the whole situation himself. And there was a very good debate about whether or not you should tell a truth about a society which then may be used by other people to discredit that particular group in the wider world of global discourse. It was a very interesting and useful debate, but it was held in a library.
Every branch public library, pretty well everywhere, has at least one public access internet terminal. And that has been a very important factor in reviving the use of the public library network after a period when its use was declining quite substantially. The historic library, which was a place where we went to find a book in which we would find information or entertainment or whatever it was we were looking for, has now become this sort of metaphor for a mechanism for retrieving the information that we want. We use phrases like digital library, electronic library. We are not talking about anything that resembles this room. There is a degree of physicality to an electronic library because the media which carry the digital signals are themselves physical. Their tapes, their discs, whatever it might be. But we don't envisage going to it, we envisage bringing the bits of it we want to us. And I think one can find a lot of parallels to the way in which we search the net, to the way in which librarians over centuries have devised ways of searching libraries. But they break down at quite an early point because A, it can be done without mediation, and B, it can be done in much more subtle and sophisticated and targeted ways.
The idea of flat structures so that everyone has access to various databases. They're not hidden away in a manager's filing cabinet. Everything's a bit more democratic and open. And there's a very good document dealing with information arrangements in MI5 in 1940, where MI5 had to move to Wormwood Scrubs, the prison in West London, and all the MI5 officers were kept in individual cells in terms of offices. And the memo says, although we've got more space in the accommodation in Wormwood Scrubs, the arrangement of the offices with officers in individual cells obviates against good exchange of ideas within the organisation. So that they were aware then that a key facet of good organisational procedure was to have the network, and these individual cells were working against the network.
What we lose, and I think this is a really significant point, what we lose is actually the serendipity of the library, oddly enough.
As soon as you get a collection of any size, it has to be organised, it has to be systematised, and that usually comes back to the way people think of knowledge and organise knowledge in their own minds.
In the late 60s, an American scientist, scholar, visionary called Nelson conceptualized what we now call hypertext, i.e. the ability to click, as it were, and to move from one set of information to another without going through intervening stages, the way we surf the web. And Nelson envisaged at the same time what he called Xanadu, and the allusion obviously was to Coleridge. And Xanadu was to be a universal electronic library. All the knowledge in the world was going to be contained in it. And I think we have now got to the point where we realize that that can never be true. That although huge amounts of knowledge and information and data are going to be created and stored electronically and will only be available electronically, which in itself creates a whole other set of problems about long-term data storage, there is vast amounts of information, of cultural material, which will never be in electronic form. And that is why something like a physical library will continue to be necessary.
There's been an information revolution in terms of technology. That's undeniable. But whether we've actually entered an entirely new society is I find that very hard to swallow. It seems to me that the continuities are stronger than the discontinuities. And the continuities are that we're still existing in a capitalist society in the West, and one could argue that the information and communication technologies of recent years are merely a way of buttressing that capitalism. Ideas of surveillance are still very strong, and one can trace the history of surveillance back through modernity. Surveillance hasn't been invented by digital technologies. And generally, I think in the West we're still, to go back to this idea of the Enlightenment project, we're still very much part of the modern society that's been evolving over the last 200 or 300 years. And these continuities outweigh any proposition made by Bill Gates and a number of other people that perhaps should know better that we've entered a fundamentally new age.
Because of the exponential growth in what we know, we are creating more and more of a problem about how to control it, how to understand it, how to retrieve it, how to organize it in a systematic way, without which we can't retrieve it. In the early years of computing, which for these purposes is the late 50s, early 60s, the typical form of data input into a computer was on punch cards. We no longer have punch card readers. There are vast data sets, including allegedly the results of censuses in the United States, of which the raw data can no longer be read because the machines for sorting the punch cards and then reading the output no longer exist. Now, that actually happens as a phenomenon with much more recent almost digital creations, if I can put it that way. In 1986, to celebrate the 900th anniversary of the compilation of the Doomsday Book, the Department for Education and Science sponsored a vast national project involving primary school and middle school children to collect for the 1980s the kind of data that William the Conqueror collected in the 1080s to create a modern doomsday. And this was put out on a 12-inch disc on a special piece of machinery which could only be played on a BBC microcomputer. Now, I don't think there's actually a BBC microcomputer still in existence, and if there is, I doubt it works. So all that work has been lost. There is a simple issue, no, not a simple issue, an easily defined issue about the preservation of the data that we are now accumulating and how we can retrieve that in the future. What we have to do is to try to transfer data that we think we might want in the long term into a form in which we can use it in current media. And this form of migration of data and its recreation in another digital format is the only way in which we're going to be able to preserve it. What we have not done yet is work out any of the management tools for doing this. How do we bring it in the first place? How do we make sure that everything is migrated at the same time? How do we trigger the process as generations of software and hardware change? Not just over 3 to 5 years, which is what the computer scientist thinks of as long term, but 30 years, 50 years, 150 years. And there are, not in this room, but certainly in the next room, books which are a couple of 100 years old, which I can pick off the shelf and read in exactly the same way as a paperback that I bought at the train station this afternoon. That would not be true of a disc which was created in a machine using the software of a decade ago.
I have no idea who P.J. de Béranger was. He was born in Paris in 1780, and these are his works, and here are some poems by this presumably 19th century French poet. Let me find something that... Oh dear, these sound very odd poems indeed.
Bombs away, cranking left. Lasers on. Shot.
Let's not get carried away by the idea that we've entered a new age. Let's not be diverted, if you like, by the hype that surrounds that idea of a new age from key issues of, social class, difficulties in terms of distribution of wealth between East and West. I mean, these are big issues that perhaps can be slightly covered over by the prospect of a wonderful new age.
Okay, I've got some men on a road. I am rolling in self-defense.
This is the ultimate speaker's corner. This is a parliament with no elections, with no delegates, with no rules of debate, just completely open.
I hope that was the right thing to do. Me too.
The issue as a society we have to confront is the extent to which we are willing to sacrifice some of the openness and democratization of the public space in order to control its use by extremists, if that's the phrase you want to use, who represent a minority generally deemed to be undesirable, like, for example, racist groups.
But our library would be nothing without Mein Kampf in it, of course.
It would not.
I'll give you an example of something that we constantly embarrasses us. We don't have a strong Jewish collection in this library. We have about 4 items, and yet at the same time we're trying to portray the religious family that starts with Judaism, Christianity, that has strong links to Islam. We can't do it, and we get a lot of complaints that we haven't got Jewish material on display. It would be very difficult for a museum to buy Jewish material in Europe that wasn't tainted by Nazi seizure during the Holocaust.
Un étranger s'avance qui parmi nous errants redemande la France, qu'il chante en soupirant. D'une terre chérie, c'est un fils désolé, rendant une patrie aux pauvres exilés. Now that was written in 1817, when presumably there were a lot of French exiles in different parts of the world who'd been thrown out by the military and political turmoil after the Napoleonic Wars.
There have been hugely complex societies, and on a very limited scale there still are, in which literacy is not a necessary precondition of participation in society, up to a point. There are societies in which orality is, at least one could say, far more important than literacy, and in some cases the society is truly illiterate. That doesn't mean it's unsophisticated or particularly simple. But certainly in the predominant Western cultures, literacy is the basis of it, and literacy is created